My mother hired a stranger to stand up at my rehearsal dinner and call himself my secret fiancé. 40 of my future husband's family watched him point at me and say I'd left him at the altar 3 years ago. I hadn't. I'd never seen his face before that night. What none of them knew was that I spend my whole career finding people who lie for money, and within 4 minutes, I knew exactly who had paid for the lies standing in front of me. My mother had no idea the actor she hired had a conscience she never accounted for. There is a very specific kind of silence that happens in a room full of people who love you, right before someone hands them a reason not to. I felt that silence at my own rehearsal dinner. A man I had never seen before in my life stood up at the far end of the table, tapped his water glass with a fork the way you do before a toast, and said my name. Then he said he was my fiancé. Not Daniel. Him. He said we'd been engaged 3 years ago. He said I left him standing at an altar in Savannah with 200 guests and a non-refundable deposit. He said he'd spent 3 years trying to move on, and when a mutual friend told him I was getting married again, he knew he had to say something before another man made the same mistake he did. 40 people were staring at me. Daniel's mother had her hand pressed flat against her chest. And I sat there in my emerald green dress with a fork halfway to my mouth, and I thought, very calmly, in the flat professional voice I use for exactly this kind of moment, I have never seen this man before in my life. I am Vivian Cole. I'm 31 years old. And before I tell you what happened in the 4 minutes after that man sat back down, what I noticed, what I already suspected, and what it turned out my own mother had paid for, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love hand a stranger the exact words needed to destroy you and known, before anyone else in the room did, that something about it didn't add up? Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from today. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe. Because this story is just beginning. Before I take you back to where this all began, let me tell you who I was. I am a forensic accountant. Fraud examination, specifically corporate and estate fraud, the kind that hides inside numbers that look correct until you know exactly where to press. I have spent 9 years reading financial statements the way other people read faces. I can look at a spreadsheet and tell you, usually within an hour, whether the person who built it was careless or whether they were careful in a very specific, very deliberate way, the way people are careful when they're hiding something and don't want you to notice the seams. It is a strange skill to have at your own rehearsal dinner. It is an even stranger skill to have when the fraud in question is standing inside your own family. This is my story. I grew up in Charleston, in a house my grandmother built with money she made the hard way. She ran a linen and textile business for almost 40 years, built it from a single sewing machine in a rented storefront into a company that supplied hotels across 3 states. She was sharp and funny and did not suffer fools, and she loved my mother the uncomplicated way grandmothers love their only daughters, and she loved me the way people love the grandchild, who reminds them of themselves. When she passed 6 years ago, she left the bulk of her estate, just under $3 million, in a trust for me. Not for my mother, for me. But I was 25 when she died, finishing my CPA license, not yet married, and my grandmother's will had one condition written into it, the kind of condition that made perfect sense to her and would eventually make no sense to anyone else. The trust would be managed by my mother, Diane, as trustee, until I married. Upon my marriage, full control and full principal would transfer to me outright. My grandmother's reasoning, according to the attorney who read the will, was simple. She wanted someone responsible looking after the money while I was young and unmarried. She trusted my mother to hold it steady until I had, in her words, a partner to build a life with. She had no way of knowing that the 6 years her daughter spent as trustee would become 6 years my mother spent getting comfortable. I did not think about the trust very often in those 6 years. I saw the quarterly statements. They came through the estate attorney's office, formatted the way estate documents are always formatted, full of line items I understood perfectly well, because it is, quite literally, my job to understand them. I did not look closely. I want to be honest about that, the way I've learned honesty matters most in the places it costs you something. I did not audit my own mother. It did not occur to me that I needed to. She was managing money my grandmother had trusted her with, money that was going to come to me eventually regardless, and I was busy building a career and eventually falling in love with a kind, steady architect named Daniel Whitfield. I did not think about the trust at all. In fact, until the spring before our wedding, when my mother started asking questions that had nothing to do with flowers or seating charts. She wanted to know about Daniel's family's finances. Not casually. Specifically. She asked whether his parents had a prenup lawyer they used, whether his family's construction business had ever been audited, whether I'd really looked into what Daniel's family was worth before agreeing to marry into it. I told her that was not why I was marrying Daniel. She said, "Of course not, honey. I just worry about you. I want you to notice something the way I've had to notice it since." My mother has never once in her life asked me a financial question that was actually about my well-being. Every question she has ever asked me about money has eventually turned out to be about her own position relative to it. I did not know that yet, that spring. I was good at not knowing it. I had built a whole relationship with my mother out of not looking too closely at the things that would have required me to see her clearly. The first crack came in April, 2 months before the wedding. My mother suggested over lunch that Daniel and I consider postponing the wedding by a year. Just to be sure, she said. Marriage is such a big step. There's no rush. I asked her what exactly she thought we needed to be sure of. She said she just wanted me to be careful. That she'd heard things, vague things, she said, nothing specific, about families like Daniel's, old money families having complicated relationships with new people marrying in. I told her Daniel's family had been nothing but warm to me. She smiled the smile she uses when she's already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to her decision. I just want you protected, she said. I did not think at the time to ask, protected from what exactly. I did not think to ask what, precisely, would change for her, financially, structurally, on the day I got married. That is the danger of being good at your job everywhere, except the one place you need to be. I have built a career on the principle that people rarely lie about big things directly. They lie about small things, adjacent things, timing and framing and emphasis, and the big lie hides quietly underneath, protected by all the small ones. My own mother had been doing exactly that to me for months, and I had not once turned my professional eye toward my own family, because some part of me still believed that whatever else she was, she would never do that to me. The second crack came from Daniel, of all people, in May. He came home from a work trip and mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother had received a strange phone call the week before, someone claiming to be a family friend of mine, asking gently whether the Whitfields had ever had trouble with, in the caller's words, young women marrying into money and it not working out. Daniel's mother had found the call odd enough to mention it to him, though she hadn't thought much of it beyond that. I asked Daniel if he'd gotten a name. He said the caller hadn't given one, just said she was an old friend of the Cole family, checking in out of concern. I remember standing in my kitchen with that information sitting strangely in my chest, the way a wrong number in a ledger sits strangely before you can name exactly why it bothers you. I did not call my mother about it. I want you to notice, again, how many times in this story I did not act on a piece of information that should have moved me to act. That is not naivety. That is 31 years of being taught, one reasonable explanation at a time, that suspicion toward your own mother is a kind of betrayal you are not allowed to commit, even quietly, even just inside your own head. By late May, 3 weeks before the wedding, I did the thing I do at work without even thinking about it anymore. I pulled the trust statements myself. Not because I suspected fraud yet. Not consciously. But because two separate strange signals, my mother's odd questions and a stranger calling Daniel's mother, had triggered the same instinct that 15 years of forensic work has built into me like a reflex. When two unrelated data points point in the same unlikely direction, you stop trusting coincidence and you start pulling records. I requested the full trust accounting from my grandmother's estate attorney, going back 3 years, and told myself it was simple due diligence before my own money transferred to me. Nothing more. I did not tell my mother I'd requested it. The attorney's office sent everything over that Friday. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a glass of wine going warm beside me, and I did what I do for a living to strangers' businesses, except this time the business was my own family, and I read 6 years of trust statements the way I read fraud. Here is what I found. Over the previous 18 months, my mother had authorized 4 separate trustee administrative fee, withdrawals from the trust, totaling just over $110,000. Trustee fees are normal. They are expected. They are also, under South Carolina law, and under the specific terms of my grandmother's trust document, capped at a clearly defined percentage of assets under management per year. My mother's withdrawals were nearly triple the allowable cap. And beneath that, in a separate account labeled with a name I did not recognize, Cole Family Holdings LLC, nearly $200,000 had been transferred out of the trust over 3 years into an entity registered. According to the South Carolina Secretary of State's business filings, I pulled that same night, solely to my mother. I sat at my kitchen table and felt something I can only describe as a very specific, very professional stillness. The same flat calm I feel at work when a client's numbers stop making sense in exactly the way that tells you they were never supposed to make sense to anyone who looked closely. I thought about her questions about Daniel's family. I thought about the stranger who'd called his mother. And for the first time, standing at the edge of my own wedding, I understood, with total clarity, exactly what my mother was afraid of. She was not afraid Daniel wasn't good enough for me. She was afraid of the one thing my grandmother's will had always guaranteed. The moment I married, the trust would transfer fully into my name, and someone, an accountant like me, or worse, an actual auditor, would eventually look at 6 years of statements the way I just had. My mother did not want to stop my wedding because she loved me too much to see me rushed. She wanted to stop my wedding because my wedding was the deadline on a clock she had been quietly running out for years. Before I tell you what I found when I looked closer at Cole Family Holdings, and what happened 4 days later, the night before my wedding, at a rehearsal dinner my mother had insisted on helping plan down to the smallest detail, I want to pause here. Have you ever had to hold 2 truths at the exact same time? The love you have carried for someone your whole life, and the plain, cold arithmetic proving they were never quite who you believe they were? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Because what my mother had already set in motion for my rehearsal dinner was worse than anything the numbers alone could have told me. I did not confront my mother that weekend. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think the reason matters more than the confrontation itself eventually did. I did not confront her because I am, by profession and by temperament, someone who does not open with an accusation. I open with documentation. I have learned, across 9 years of walking into rooms where someone's entire livelihood is about to be dismantled by a spreadsheet, that you do not lead with what you believe. You lead with what you can prove, and you let the evidence do the terrible, quiet work of speaking for itself. So, I did the thing I always do. I built a file. I printed the trust statements. I printed the LLC filings. I printed the trustee fee schedule for my grandmother's original trust document, with the legal cap highlighted in yellow beside the actual withdrawals, so that the discrepancy would be impossible to misread even by someone determined to misread it. I did not send any of it to my mother. I did not call her. I put the folder in the bottom of my tote bag, the same bag I carried to the venue for our rehearsal dinner 4 days later, and I told myself I would deal with it after the wedding quietly, the careful way, the way I deal with everything. I did not know yet that my mother had already decided the wedding itself needed to be dealt with first. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant on the water that Daniel's parents had chosen and largely paid for, warm and unpretentious, 40 of our closest people at 3 long tables strung with soft lights. My mother had insisted, weeks earlier, on handling the seating chart and the guest list finalization herself, since she knew how particular these things could get, and wanted to save me the stress so close to the wedding. I had thought at the time that this was thoughtful. I understand now that it was logistics. My mother needed to know exactly who would be in that room and exactly where they would be sitting for what she had planned to work. Dinner was almost finished. Daniel's father had just given a warm, easy toast about welcoming me into the family. Everyone was relaxed, a little sun-tired, full of good food and wine. And then a man I had never seen before in my life stood up from a seat at the far end of the second table, a seat, I would later confirm, that had been added to the chart only 2 days prior, at my mother's specific instruction to the venue coordinator, and he tapped his glass, the way you do when you're about to speak. He said his name was Marcus. He said he and I had been engaged 3 years ago, before Daniel, before any of this. He said I had left him at the altar in Savannah, humiliated him in front of 200 guests, and disappeared from his life without explanation. He said he'd only recently learned, through what he called mutual friends, that I was doing it again, marrying someone else, moving forward like nothing had happened, and he said he could not, in good conscience, let another man walk into what he called the same mistake, without knowing the truth about who I really was. 40 people were staring at me. Daniel's mother had gone very still, her hand pressed flat against her chest. Daniel himself had turned to look at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not accusation, not yet, just a kind of desperate, searching confusion. The face of a man trying to find some version of this that made sense, and coming up empty. I have spent 9 years learning to read a room the way I read a balance sheet, and I want you to understand exactly what I felt in that moment, because it was not what anyone expected, including me. I did not feel panic. I felt the same flat, focused stillness I feel at my desk when a number refuses to reconcile. The stillness of someone whose brain has already started building the file before her heart has caught up. Because here's the thing about being a fraud examiner for 9 years. You develop an instinct for the shape of a lie even before you have the facts to disprove it. And the shape of this lie was wrong in 3 specific ways within the first 30 seconds. He never once said my last name. He described a wedding in Savannah with no venue, no date, no detail that could be checked. The vague architecture of a story built to sound specific without being verifiable. And his eyes kept flicking, very briefly, toward the far end of the second table, where my mother sat with her wine glass raised halfway to her lips, watching him with an expression of careful, rehearsed shock that did not quite reach her eyes the way genuine shock always does. I did not raise my voice. I stood up slowly, and I looked directly at the man calling himself Marcus, and I said, in the same even, unhurried tone I use when a client's controller has just handed me a story instead of an answer.
I'm sorry.
What's my last name? The table went quiet in a new way. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out for a second longer than it should have. What's my full name? I said again. The one you say I left you at the altar under.
Say it.
He looked, for just a moment, less like a wounded ex-fiancé and more like a man standing on a stage whose lines had suddenly run out.
Cole, he said.
Vivian Cole. That's my mother's last name and my own, I said. It's on every wedding invitation in this room. It's not information. Try again. Where in Savannah? What month? What year? He did not answer. And in the silence that followed, the particular silence of 40 people watching a story come apart in real time, I watched something happen in his face that I have seen exactly twice before in my career, in interviews with people paid to lie who had not fully accounted for what it would feel like to lie to a room full of faces that trusted them. His shoulders dropped. He looked, for just a second, directly at my mother. And then he looked back at me, and he said, quietly, in a voice that had lost every trace of the wounded fiancé performance from 30 seconds earlier, I'm so sorry. I can't do this. He sat back down, put both hands over his face, and said, muffled, to the table, to Daniel, to all 40 of us. Your mother paid me $800 to say that. I needed the money. I didn't think it would feel like this. I did not say anything for a moment. I want to be honest with you about what I felt because it was not vindication, not yet. It was something closer to grief arriving early, the particular kind that shows up before you've even finished confirming the thing you're grieving. My mother's face had gone the specific shade of pale that comes when a plan collapses faster than the person who built it ever imagined it could. That is not, she started, her voice too bright, too fast. Marcus, honey, I think you're confused. You must be thinking of... Diane, he said, still not looking up. I have the text messages. I have the $800 in my bank account from your Venmo. I'm not doing this for you. Daniel's father set down his wine glass, very slowly. Daniel had not said a single word since the man sat back down. He was looking at me, and then at my mother, and the confusion on his face was giving way, second by second, to something much colder. I reached into my tote bag. I had not planned to use the folder that night. I had built it for after the wedding, for a quiet, careful conversation my mother and I would have alone the way I do everything, Evidence first, confrontation second, no audience, no scene. But some decisions get made for you the moment someone else decides to make your wedding rehearsal into a stage. I set the folder on the table in the space where the wine glasses had been cleared, and I opened it to the first page, the trustee fee schedule, the legal cap highlighted in yellow, the actual withdrawals beside it in a column that did not match. Since we're doing this here, I said, there's something else you should all see. I did not raise my voice through any of what came next. I have learned, the hard way, across 9 years of rooms exactly like this one, that the person who stays quiet is almost always the one the room ends up believing, because volume reads as performance and stillness reads as certainty. I walked Daniel's parents and my own father, who had sat through the entire evening in the particular silence he reserves for things he already suspects and does not want to name, through 6 years of trust statements in under 4 minutes. I told them about Grandma's will, about the marriage clause, about what, exactly, would have transferred to me the moment I signed a marriage certificate, and what my mother had been quietly withdrawing from that trust for 3 years under a fee structure that violated the document's own terms by nearly 300%. I told them about Cole Family Holdings LLC, registered solely in my mother's name, and the $200,000 that had moved into it from a trust that was never hers to spend. My mother did not deny the paperwork. There was no version of denying it that would have survived even a single follow-up question from anyone else at that table with a working calculator. What she did instead was reach for the explanation she has used my entire life, the one that has worked on me more times than I am proud to admit. Everything I did, she said, her voice cracking in the specific way it cracks when she needs a room to feel sorry for her. I did to protect you. I was scared you were rushing into something. I panicked. I made a mistake hiring that man, I know that, but the money was going to come to you eventually anyway, Vivian. I was managing it. I was your mother managing your money. You were managing, I said, $110,000 over the legal cap and $200,000 more into an account with your name on it, and you were about to let a stranger call me a jilted, dishonest woman in front of my future husband's family so that the clock on all of it would stop running. I did not need to say anything else. My father, who had said almost nothing all evening, finally spoke, quietly, to my mother, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use in 31 years of marriage to her. Diane, he said, show me the account tonight. Not the lawyer. Not tomorrow. Tonight. She did not have an answer for that either. The wedding happened 5 days later, as planned, on schedule, exactly the way Daniel and I had always intended it to. My mother was not there. She had not been formally disinvited, not in any loud, dramatic way. She simply understood, by the morning after that dinner, that showing up would not go the way she needed it to, and she stayed home. The trust transferred to me in full on the morning of my wedding, exactly as my grandmother had written it, 6 years after she'd left it in careful, deliberate trust with a daughter she believed would hold it steady until it was time to let go. I did not sue my mother. I want to be honest with you about that too, because I know some of you are waiting for a courtroom scene that never came. I went, instead, to the trust attorney directly, with everything I'd found, and had my mother formally removed as trustee, a simple administrative filing, given the documented breach, that required no litigation at all, only paperwork and a signature from a judge who read 6 pages and did not need a 7th. She was ordered to repay the excess withdrawals, on a schedule the attorney and I set together, quietly, without a headline or a hearing. I have not spoken to her since that filing was finalized. My father calls every few weeks. We are rebuilding something slow and careful, the way you rebuild anything after you finally understand what it was actually standing on. Marcus, the man my mother hired, sent me a written apology 2 weeks after the wedding, along with a copy of every text message my mother had sent arranging the whole thing, unprompted, unasked. I did not need the apology. I appreciated that he offered it anyway. If there is one thing I want you to take from a rehearsal dinner almost ruined by a stranger my own mother paid $800, it is this. The people who are most afraid of you seeing clearly are usually the ones who have the most reason to keep you looking somewhere else. My mother spent 6 years hoping I would never turn my professional eye toward my own family, because she knew, better than anyone, exactly what I would find if I did. I did not go looking for fraud in my own life. I simply could not stop myself from looking closely once the numbers stopped adding up. The same instinct that has kept my clients' businesses honest for 9 years finally, when it mattered most, protected me. If someone in your life has ever needed you not to look too closely, tell me about it in the comments. And if this one hit home for you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their instincts were right all along. Subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.